Last year, when my mum died, 10 years after my father had, my sisters and I turned to each other and said, well, I guess we're orphans now. And for us as adults with good relationships and financial security, being an orphan doesn't quite carry that sense of Dickensian tragedy of a child who is lost and abandoned and vulnerable, but it's still a very, very evocative, striking word. And it's the word which really stood out for me when I read this Sunday's Gospel, which is part of Jesus' farewell discourse at the Last Supper, where Jesus says, I will not leave you orphans. I think that Jesus and those who remembered and wrote down his words used that word quite deliberately because of the sense of power that the word orphan contains. For the disciples, Jesus would have been the most significant person in their lives. The power of his presence, which brought about transformation and healing and forgiveness for them and for so many others, made him such an important person that they had left everything behind to follow him. But now, at the Last Supper, Jesus knew what they didn't yet know, that he would soon be leaving them. And so Jesus, throughout this speech and the prayer that follows, tries to prepare his disciples for what will happen next. And Jesus promises, I will not leave you orphaned. Because he knew they would need that reassurance when the very next day he would die on the cross. And later, even after his resurrection, he would ascend to heaven. And the disciples would no longer be with him in the same way. That sense of fear of being alone, the fear of loneliness and abandonment, is something which I think probably sits fairly deep in all of our hearts. The fear of loneliness or the fear of being alone is actually a terrible driver for many people's thoughts and feelings and decisions. It drives people to date or marry the wrong person. It drives people to manipulate others, to try and hold people close and make them need them and rely on them for motivations other than love. It makes people befriend people who are destructive or critical or just not good for them, because sometimes anything feels better than being alone. I know I've made some of those bad decisions in my life too. I remember back when I was 18, 19 years old and discerning priesthood, having to really think through what celibacy would mean for me, and to say, if I choose to be celibate, then I might be alone all my life. I might end up very lonely. But I remember in prayer so strongly having the reassurance of God saying, well, no, don't throw away something good because of a fear of what might happen in the future. As I look back, I am so very glad that I was able to overcome that fear and to move forward to seminary and now priesthood and the celibacy that is part of that. But it's only been the last few years I think I've really dealt with the idea of loneliness and the fear of loneliness more adequately. About a dozen years ago, I read a wonderful book called The Inner Loneliness by a Benedictine monk, Father Sebastian Moore. And in it, he explores the whole notion of loneliness in our lives in a quite existential way. He coined this term the ineluctable loneliness, and I had to go and look that word up to find out that ineluctable means unavoidable or inevitable, inescapable. And he talks about this loneliness being part and parcel of who we are. And to cut a long story short, what this book taught me was that to be lonely and to feel alone is not pathological. It's not a character flaw. It's not a failure of being unable to make good relationships. No, it's simply that's who we are. It's the base state of human nature. We are all ultimately alone because nobody else can ever be inside us and fulfill our deepest needs. And we know that, or many of you know that from the experience of losing someone you love. If you ever lost a spouse, a close friend, a sibling, or had a partner leave you or move away and break relationship, you know the utter anguish of that kind of loneliness when the void in us is once again exposed that perhaps that other person had filled for a while. And so Father Sebastian Moore goes on to say this lonely space within us, of course, can only be filled by God, because it is a space which is made by God and for God, and it's oriented towards the infinite, the transcendent. And so nothing else and no one else will ever fully fill that. It's why even if we have wonderful, fulfilling relationships, we might still sense there is something more we desire as we move closer and closer toward God. And so the words Jesus gives in this Sunday's Gospel, I think, are so powerful and so reassuring for all of us. But Jesus says, I will not leave you orphaned. He says, I will send you another advocate, by which we understand to mean the Holy Spirit. And we'll explore that in the next 2 weeks with the great feasts of Ascension and Pentecost. But Jesus goes on to explain a little bit about the advocate, the Holy Spirit, saying that you know him because he abides in you. He will be in you. And he says, I live and you also live and I will be in you. So this sense of Jesus and through his Spirit, the Holy Spirit, being the ones who can dwell deep within us as the only ones who can ultimately ever fill that lonely space within us. And I know for myself, when I find loneliness kind of creeping up, it's actually often because I've moved away from God or I've blocked myself from an awareness of the presence of God and God's Spirit. So for me, loneliness now becomes a barometer of how I'm doing, not necessarily with all my other relationships, but really how I'm doing in my spiritual life. So it's a wonderful book, Father Sebastian Moore's The Inner Loneliness. If you can get a copy of it, it's a fairly dense read, but it's one of the books that's utterly transformed my life and my spiritual life. So I invite you to stop for a moment and wonder, what does the idea of loneliness or aloneness mean to you? Is it something that you are scared of or fearful of? I wonder if you can look back and see, have you made choice in your life perhaps out of the fear of loneliness and to avoid loneliness? Or perhaps you're even doing that now. As always, the answer for most questions is to go deeper in prayer, to let our hearts be open and to acknowledge that empty space within us. Say, God, here I am. There is an emptiness in me. There is an aloneness in me. Lord, come and fill this part of me. In the next 2 weeks, as we celebrate Ascension and Pentecost, I might say more about how we might reach out to God in prayer to do just that. God bless you.